Prime Minister Mark Carney says the Canada-China relationship is at a turning point after meeting with President Xi Jinping on the sidelines of the summit.
Prime Minister Carney and President Xi meet for Canada's fraught relationship with China and for Carney's ambitions to diversify trade.
Prime Minister Mark Carney is signaling a new approach this morning. We have images from Carney's meeting just a few hours ago with Xi Jinping on the sidelines of the APEC summit.
Trump set out to teach Canada a lesson, but the ripple effects reached far beyond Ottawa. By the fall of 2025, a heated clash between President Donald Trump and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney had evolved into something far larger, a turning point in global power. The White House's tariffs and trade shutdowns, meant to strengthen America's hand, instead pushed long-standing allies to seek new partners. Canada began turning to Asia, Europe reopened channels with Beijing, and Japan deepened its resource ties with China. A new economic alignment was quietly taking shape, one that could redefine the balance of power for years to come. Could this be the moment when America's allies start building a world without it? The break came without warning in early October. President Donald Trump froze all trade negotiations with Canada after a satirical commercial from Ontario mocked his tariff agenda. Ottawa didn't respond with outrage or speeches, it changed direction. Within days, Prime Minister Mark Carney's team was in Asia, arranging high-level meetings that included a private discussion with Chinese President Xi Jinping. For Canada, this wasn't a sudden pivot, but a necessary evolution. Years of rising tariffs on autos, steel, and lumber had strained its industries and driven up consumer costs. The message from Washington was clear. Even America's closest neighbors would be treated as rivals. Facing that reality, Carney sought to expand Canada's reach beyond North America and reduce its dependence on the United States. Critics at home warned the move could backfire, calling it a leap from one difficult partner to another. Yet the motivation wasn't ideological, it was economic survival. When the largest economy in the world closes its markets, a mid-sized nation like Canada must find an alternative, and Canada wasn't alone in that search. Across Europe and Asia, governments once firmly tied to Washington were rethinking their positions. When the White House introduced sweeping tariffs between 25% and 35% on imports in mid-2025, it shook the foundations of Western trade. European leaders began reopening channels with Beijing to secure critical supply chains, while Japan quietly expanded its mineral exports to China through new port agreements in Yokohama and Dalian. South Korean manufacturers, long reliant on American buyers, signed multi-billion-dollar contracts with Chinese electronics firms. Each of these nations had signed trade frameworks with the United States earlier that year, the European Union in August, Japan in September, and South Korea in October. But few believed those agreements would last. Trump's tendency to cancel or suspend talks overnight left partners uncertain about their future. For them, China wasn't a preferred choice. It was a safety net. The White House's version of America First was built on economic pressure. Through tariffs and renegotiated deals, Trump demanded that companies move production back home and accept American-defined rules of access. In the short term, it appeared to work. Factories reopened in parts of the Midwest, and the administration celebrated each new report of reshored jobs. But diplomacy built on intimidation wears thin fast. When the president severed discussions with Ottawa over a television ad, it sent a global message that trade with the United States could become personal at any moment. For decades, America's influence rested on consistency. NATO ensured military security, USMCA bound North America together, and the G7 offered political coordination. Replacing that predictability with volatility changed how allies behaved. They still valued access to U.S. markets, but they no longer trusted the rules governing them. Beijing moved quickly to take advantage. By late September, China's Ministry of Commerce reported a 12% increase in trade with Western nations compared to the previous year, despite worsening tensions with Washington. Canadian export data showed rising shipments of agriculture and energy products through Pacific ports in British Columbia, mostly bound for Asian buyers. For China, this was a straightforward opportunity. The more erratic Washington appeared, the more attractive Beijing's stability became. For Western nations, the calculation was far more complicated. China offered growth and access to vast consumer markets, but at the cost of growing dependence on a powerful rival that dominated rare earth production and tightly monitored foreign investment. The G7 economies didn't trust Beijing's political model, yet they couldn't fully turn away from its economic gravity. This new order wasn't built on shared values. It was shaped by necessity. Survival had become the driving force of global engagement. In Ottawa, Carney faced a strategic dilemma. Moving closer to China risked reopening old wounds. Canada still remembered the 2018 arrests of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, along with the trade retaliation that followed. Yet in a world where U.S. policies shifted without warning, sticking to the old model meant watching growth fade. So Carney took a quieter, more deliberate path. When Trump lashed out over the Ontario ad, Canada avoided counter-tariffs and inflammatory rhetoric. Instead, the government advanced its new trade blueprint, a $300 billion expansion plan centered on emerging Asian markets. Talks began with the Philippines under the ASEAN framework, with more countries in line for negotiations. The plan was straightforward: build economic stability through diversification, not dependence. Canada's trade strategy no longer revolved around American approval. It revolved around opportunity, where Canadian goods could move freely and where partnerships could form without constant political friction. Observers in Ottawa describe Carney's leadership as measured and pragmatic. Where Trump governed through emotion, Carney leaned on calculation and patience. By choosing not to escalate, he positioned Canada as a responsible actor in a volatile environment, the partner willing to engage with anyone who respected fair trade. Even Beijing saw the difference. China viewed Canada not as a proxy of Washington, but as an independent player open to mutual benefit. Meanwhile, the broader consequences of America's tariff policies were becoming impossible to ignore. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the World Trade Organization both warned that prolonged tariffs were increasing consumer prices and destabilizing global production networks. By October 2025, U.S. inflation had climbed close to 5%, with vehicle and energy costs leading the surge. At the same time, China's share of global manufacturing reached 31%, the highest level in 5 years. Across Europe and Asia, trade routes were being quietly redesigned to reduce exposure to American unpredictability. This didn't mean the West was cutting ties with Washington. It meant countries were building additional options. In practical terms, that shift translated into more Chinese investment in European infrastructure, more Canadian grain moving through Pacific shipping lanes, and more Asian firms buying into Western resource projects. The world was no longer built around a single center of gravity. Trump viewed his tariffs as tools of discipline, a way to bring allies into line, but the effect was the opposite. The measures pushed nations to diversify their economies, creating new networks that reduced their dependence on the United States. What began as a campaign to reinforce American dominance has become the catalyst for a different kind of global order, one where China's economic influence expands in areas once firmly under U.S. control. Canada's outreach to Asia is not an act of betrayal, but a response to changing conditions. Europe's renewed engagement with Beijing doesn't signal loyalty, it signals adaptation. Every move stems from a desire for stability in an uncertain environment. And the more America turns inward, the more its partners look outward. Trump's approach to trade has always rested on confrontation. From the moment he returned to office, his administration unleashed a wave of tariffs, 10% on most imports, and an especially punishing 50% on Canadian metals. The theory behind it was straightforward: drive production back to American factories and force allies to accept U.S. terms. Early headlines celebrated the idea, highlighting small gains in domestic output and job figures. But as 2025 unfolded, the hidden costs began to surface. That subtle shift changed everything. The tariffs that were supposed to tighten the screws on Ottawa were beginning to hurt American consumers instead. Inflation climbed, supply chains buckled, and manufacturers voiced growing frustration. The harder Washington pushed, the clearer it became that the two countries were more intertwined than the tariffs allowed. Behind closed doors, even some within the White House began acknowledging what the data made undeniable. The U.S. couldn't isolate itself from its closest neighbor without paying a price. It was in this environment that Carney revived one of the most controversial topics in modern North American politics: the Keystone XL pipeline. The mention caught attention immediately. For more than 15 years, Keystone had symbolized the divide between energy policy and environmental concern. Barack Obama canceled it in 2015. Trump resurrected it during his first term. Joe Biden shut it down again on his first day in office. By 2025, even the project's developer, TC Energy, had abandoned it entirely. Almost everyone assumed it was gone forever. Carney didn't bring Keystone up as a construction plan, but as a signal. The message was quiet but pointed. Canada's oil and gas resources are not merely exports. They are a lifeline woven into the continent's infrastructure. A revived pipeline would give the U.S. a secure alternative to volatile suppliers abroad and provide Canada's energy-rich provinces a new outlet for production. It would relieve pressure on Alberta and offer an opening for economic cooperation that could benefit both countries. For Trump, who had long presented himself as the defender of U.S. energy independence, it was an idea that hit the right political chord. If the president embraced it, he could claim victory for bringing a major project back to life. If he dismissed it, he would face tough questions about why America preferred costly, unstable imports over dependable Canadian supply. Either way, Carney had positioned Canada as the indispensable partner in a negotiation that had started one-sided. Ottawa had shifted from reacting to leading. Reports later confirmed that Trump was receptive to the idea. No formal deal emerged, but the atmosphere changed. For the first time since the tariff war began, Washington needed something only Canada could deliver. In the optics of diplomacy, it looked routine. A few smiles, handshakes, and promises of continued dialogue, but the balance had quietly tipped. Beneath the photo ops, the numbers told a different story. Data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis showed U.S. exports slipping nearly 4% during the second quarter of 2025, largely due to retaliatory trade measures and inflated costs for key materials. Factories that had once cheered the tariffs were now warning of production slowdowns. Consumer prices climbed and domestic output wavered. What began as a campaign to showcase American resilience was turning into an economic loop of rising prices and growing political frustration. Across the Midwest, governors and manufacturing associations began pushing back. States that had long supported the administration's economic agenda were urging tariff relief, particularly for trade with Canada. They argued that protecting American industry no longer meant building walls around it, but reconnecting with the partners who made it viable in the first place. Canada had shifted from defense to offense, using precision rather than confrontation to regain influence. By turning Trump's own methods into leverage, Carney had rebalanced the table. As autumn deepened, both nations faced the next phase of negotiation. Whether those discussions lead to a revised tariff structure or a broader North American energy pact remains uncertain. What is clear, though, is how the pressure loop has reversed. The tactics that once boxed in Canada are now circling back toward the United States. The trade conflict that began as a test of dominance has evolved into a reminder that neither side can afford isolation.